We are a community that wants to see every person have a life-changing encounter with Christ, and that's what we're knowing the path, walking the path, doing our best to. And Jared, if you'll come up here, if you haven't met Jared Purdin is the man. Cool. Yeah. Jared and Sky, they're going to be running our discipleship course, and they're doing a path group, Christianity 101, right? And I would encourage you, if you've been baptized in the last year, when we get our path groups going again, attend this path group. I think it's going to change your life. I can't think of any other couples I would trust as much to disciple you as these two. They are incredible. They're a gift to this church, and they've been given wisdom from the Lord, I believe, and very intelligent. And Jared doesn't believe this about himself, but there's a reason we've had him up here twice this year. I think he's a gifted speaker and very gifted at communicating. And I'm excited to actually be able to be here this time to hear him. So if you'd welcome Jared Purdin.
All right, this is on. Wow, well, you set the bar pretty high, so we'll see how it goes. But yeah, today what we're going to be talking about is Matthew 13:44 through 58. So I kind of broke this up into a few different parts. The first part is two different parables, and then one is a longer parable, and the last one is about how Jesus, what him and his disciples were going through when they went to Jesus' hometown. All pretty connected, or at least has a common theme, I believe, and we'll kind of go through that. But first, let's go through these first two verses here. So, Matthew 13:44. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. And in the next verse, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. The next verse after that, when he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. Okay, so in these three verses, actually, we have Jesus talking about individuals who had found some great treasure, either in a field or while looking for something, and basically going all out for it. So I guess I'll open it up right away to anything that makes you think of. What does this parable kind of incite in you? What are some thoughts that come to mind as you hear these verses? Yes?
Basically, get rid of everything that you've ever had in the world and put it all on Christ.
Okay, yep, going all out for Christ. Yes, I agree. Yep, and specifically what it talks about here, and Christ would be perfectly apt, but what he talks about in verse 44, it says the kingdom of heaven, which is also a phrase that's been used a good amount in the New Testament before. Yes?
One thing is that they were both looking for something.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, they knew what they were looking for and recognized it when they found it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yep, I would agree. It's not this passive thing. It's not kind of that they're just, sitting back and the kingdom of heaven is like fallen into their lap. They're looking for something of value. And they're looking for something of value to put their whole into. Agreed. Yes?
What jumps out for me is stewardship, what we have. Think of save, invest. This is like get rid of everything so you know the value.
Mm-hmm.
Moving things around that are able to capitalize on something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I think about a lot of what we're talking about right now, I don't have this one written down, but I was thinking about it as we were talking, is there's a story within one of the Gospels, and I totally blank on where exactly it is, but there's the story of the woman who gives 2 coins, all that she has, basically, to the church, versus the rich man who tithes. And Jesus tells his disciples, truly I tell you, she has given more than they have. Which seems very odd because the person who tithes presumably gave more than 2 coins, or whatever the currency was at that time. But she gave everything she had, which does seem to show that the kingdom of heaven is much more interested, not even in exact monetary value or exact amount that you can give with your God-given abilities, but it's more interested in what you are willing to give. Are you willing to give your whole self, or are you just going to give, 10%? For the record, tithing is a biblical principle. We shouldn't not tithe. That is a good idea. But it does seem like the New Testament, like many things with Jesus and what he says, is trying to push us further. When Jesus talks in Matthew and he says that, you've heard it been said, do not commit murder, but truly I tell you, if you look at your neighbor with hatred, you've killed him in your heart and you've committed murder. Jesus is taking what the law did and he's fulfilling it and he's bringing it even further, which frankly is really condemning because if we're all being honest with ourselves, how much of us give 100% of ourselves to God, to Jesus, to the kingdom of heaven, right? And I'm not saying give 100% to Heartland, even though, I'm sure giving a lot of money to Heartland would be great for all of us, but I'm saying giving 100% to the kingdom of heaven, which goes even bigger than Heartland, right? So those types of messages, I think, can be really, really condemning, but also, as we'll see here, really refreshing in terms of what we have with Jesus' saving grace. Any other thoughts on these verses? Yes?
Well, it's kind of like I was thinking the know the path, walk the path shirts that a lot of y'all have. That if you're kind of, if Jesus is walking on a path through a forest, let's say, and you want to walk that path, you're either leaving everything you have behind to follow him or taking everything you have along with you. So it's that complete commitment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's what the disciples did, right? The disciples abandoned everything and they followed Christ. Even in times where Christ was saying things or doing things that to them seemed just weird and crazy, which actually we're going to get to in one of these upcoming parables, but even when things didn't seem like they were going the right way, especially after Christ's death, still choosing to follow him and have hope. Yeah, yep.
Like the one guy, he had joy when he did all that. He didn't.
Oh, okay.
He had his joy, joy in the process. It wasn't like a demanding drudgery or something.
Yeah, that is a good point. That's a good point, because a lot of times, and like I know for myself, even something simple, right? Like you have time at the end of the day, and you're like, oh, I'm really tired. I could pray, or I could just, scroll through Netflix and eventually find something to watch, right? A very simple first world problem type of thing. But even something like that is like, oh, I guess I should pray, right? I guess I should pray and do this. And there are times where, yeah, we don't always have joy when going through those things. Yeah, so somebody over here. Yep.
I was thinking maybe it's selfish to think this way, but it feels maybe like we're the pearl or we're the treasure hidden in the field, and Jesus came and found us and gave everything to give us.
Yeah, I've heard that explanation before when when this parable has been talked about. And I know specifically it talks about the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden, but I think it's totally fair to say that what we know about Jesus' character, having joy as he went to the cross, as he died for us, I think it's fair to say that this does work if you look at it in a sense that way, right? In the same way that we ought to have joy when seeking the kingdom of heaven and trying to bring that about. It is also, I think, completely fair to say that Jesus, in everything he did, had joy, even if it wasn't always making him happy, as we see in like the Garden of Gethsemane, but he always had joy when he did it. Yeah.
I just find it really interesting because I was rereading 44, and it's not like he was in his field that he found the treasure. No, he went to some other field, found it, then he went, all right, I'm going to put it back since this actually isn't mine quite yet. Went and bought the whole field with all the possibilities of the problems in that field and everything else just to have that treasure that was hidden in it.
Yes. That's actually a great point. I was going to talk about that here soon. But it's interesting with these two examples, these characters in these two parables are what you might call thrifty, which isn't always a great word. It's somebody who's kind of sees the value in something and makes a smart business decision and kind of almost undercuts somebody or tries to not tell them the real value that they have. When I hear this parable, one of the things I think of with this parable is actually Paul going to the Gentiles and how many of the Jews viewed Jesus, and what we're going to get to later, how the people in Jesus' hometown viewed Jesus. But it does seem like you could look at this parable and in many ways see how perhaps many of the Jewish people didn't realize that they really had the Messiah. And in some ways, you could see how that gift and was given to the Gentiles. And in some ways, Jesus, being a Jew himself, kind of was a stumbling block for a lot of the Jews to see who he really was. But yeah, anything else? Okay. Yeah, the only other thing I kind of thought of here that we haven't really touched on here is talking about both the kingdom of heaven and then talking about God's sovereignty. So I know we've talked about this in other sermons before too, but when you guys hear the kingdom of heaven, when you hear that phraseology used in the New Testament often, what's something you guys think of when you think of the kingdom of heaven? Beautiful? Okay, what's another thing that we maybe think of when we think of the kingdom of heaven? Where do we think the kingdom of heaven is? Yeah.
Well, I think about peace.
Peace. Okay. Yeah. Home. Yep.
Too many people think it's future,
Mm.
but it's not really. It's actually right now.
Mm.
It's among us. The kingdom of heaven is among us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say it's a good point. It's both. Jesus often says the kingdom of heaven is near, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
I think when we get to heaven, we're gonna not necessarily, well, I mean, we only see what we see now, so it is now. But when we really get to heaven, it's not gonna be any comparison.
There's no way to do it.
Mm. Yeah.
I think of it as the sovereignty, like everything that is under the sovereignty of God, and so it's a kingdom of people at where the people are a part of His kingdom, and so that is living and beyond.
Yeah. I know when many times it's talked about, and I've read a few different books on this particular topic, but there is kind of these two ideas that do sometimes tend to compete against each other, which is, the kingdom of heaven is in the future. It's this idea of, the pearly gates, clouds in the sky. It's Peter at the gate, letting you in or not letting you in, depending on how you look at it. But while that, in some aspects, is true, while it is the future, it's also here. The kingdom of heaven is, we are all, in a sense, soldiers for the kingdom of heaven, or ambassadors, however you want to view that, right? And so we are all tasked with bringing the kingdom of heaven about. We're all tasked with putting in our all to bring that towards what we're doing, towards the new Jerusalem, as it's talked about. Yes?
It's interesting that you say soldiers. So there's a really good movie. It's called The Kingdom of Heaven.
Yeah.
So there's a scene where newly Lord is sitting in front of the king, and they're sitting in front of a chessboard. And it's the king of Jerusalem at the time of the crusade. And it's right at this point that Al-Sadin of the Muslim army is coming against and eventually overtakes Jerusalem. But the king is sitting in front of this new lord that just acquired lands, title, and everything else. And he says the kingdom of heaven is a kingdom of consciousness. He says just because a king will move you like a pawn to have you do this or have you do that, but when you go to heaven and you stand before God, your conscience has to be right and upstanding in a way that you can't say, hey, my actions because of a king asked me to do this, I can't be in the wrong. So it's one of those things of that I always say, like, honor before the king, on bent knee, obviously if we're operating with inside of a kingdom, there's a king, it's the king's business, and as soldiers of that king, like, we need to know with inside of the kingdom that we're operating, who is our king and how do we serve him? And how do we hold on to his morals, values, all those things as a badge of honor upon our shield. It's just interesting that I can't go before God and say, well, pastor had me do so-and-so, or my coworker put me in this position, or my belief because of this. You have to stand before a king eventually. And on bent knee. and answer for what you've done in this life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that's definitely true. I think what I get a lot from these verses here is that while in no way, shape, or form are these verses in any way undercutting God's sovereignty, it seems to me that these verses are in many ways asking us to be actively searching and looking. It asks us to be active participants in the kingdom of heaven, not just treat it like, I'm just going to live here and until I die and then I go to heaven. That's great. I'm not just going to just kind of float through life and, just kind of do the business that I need to do and do things acceptably and then I go to heaven. Like, we're supposed to act, it seems like to me, like we're actively searching and selling out for it at all times, which I'm not saying is easy, but yes.
I think of, when I think about heaven and God, I gotta think about my spiritual life, because He is spirit.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wonderful thing, but sometimes that's where we get involved with our doing too much and not just depend on His Spirit and let Him do the work in us. There's a verse in 2 Corinthians.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 3:17.
2 Corinthians 3:17.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Lord is spirit, and where the spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that freedom is something only our spiritual life can understand.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And while I think a lot of these verses do talk about, being active and looking, I think it's extremely important to realize that we are given a spirit of grace. We're given discernment. We're given all these different things. It's not just us going on our own, earning our salvation, right? It's us actively wishing and wanting to be a part of this kingdom, to say, like, I know that you've already made me a part of it. Now I want to do something to grow it, right? It's a privilege to do such a thing, right? That's how I would view essentially the kingdom of heaven. Very different than basically every other religion in a sense, because every other religion, you earn your way into heaven, or you earn your way into some type of higher salvation or higher levels of heaven, or however they view it, right? But Christianity is very different. Like, you're in. You're just in. All you need to do is ask. All you need to do is ask. But now you have the privilege to be a part of growing that. If we want to go to the next slide here. So, another one here, another parable. This one's a bit longer that Jesus goes through. So it says, this is actually what I put in here. I forgot to put this in here, but this is related to what kind of Steve was talking about a little bit ago. But this is Matthew 6:19 through 21, something I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with. But do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourself treasure in heaven where moth and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be. The reason I ended up putting this verse in there is it's interesting contrast to the verses we just read about the individuals being thrifty, about them looking for, treasure on earth. Because Jesus uses this parable kind of to appeal to, in many ways, our natural greed, but to say, like, the treasure you ought to be searching for is not just gold, but it ought to be something that lasts, that doesn't fade away or decay. And so I thought that was an interesting little comparison there. But you can go to the next slide. Okay, so Matthew 13:47 through 52. Once again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. When it was full, the fishermen pulled it up on the shore, and they sat down and collected the good fish in the basket, but threw the bad away. This is how it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous and throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all these things? Jesus asked. Yes, they replied. He said to them, "Therefore, every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out his storeroom, new treasures as well as old." So technically, there's a little bit longer parable with a few more interesting consequences, and one really short example. But what are some of the things, as we kind of reflect on these verses, what are the things that stick out to you? What are some of the things that you notice as you hear these? Yes.
He's using a parable they would understand as fishermen.
Yep, as we know, like Peter, many of the other or a few of the other ones too, who I can't remember, but many of them were fishermen, so it's relatable for a lot of the disciples. That's definitely true, and they would have understood that as they fished, they would have caught good fish, and then they would have caught rotten fish, right? Yes.
I don't know too many times that Jesus checks for understanding either. Like, have you understood all these things?
Mm.
Like, I feel like sometimes he just moves on to the next thing. But to even be like, all right, you get it? And I'm going to clarify yet what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's a good point, because a lot of times he'll kind of move on to the next one, or just say, for those who have ears to hear and eyes to see, like, you get it. It's basically English or American equivalent of, if you get it, right? And at least that's how I think of it sometimes. Yeah, yes.
It's interesting in this one that they are actually taking part of the separation versus the other one where there was asked to grow together. This one here, they actually separated the good fish from the bad fish.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it talks about, the angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Yes.
Wisdom in our, the fishing net in this almost seems like truth and wisdom, that those who are able to see it, those who it is revealed to, are those that will be drawn to heaven.
Mm. Yeah, the heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all the fish.
Especially with like Proverbs, it talks about how wisdom cries out from the streets.
Mm. Mm.
Cries out from the streets. For those that listen to it, it will make itself apparent.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think it's definitely the case that net, catching those fish and catching the good ones. Yeah, I mean, it definitely takes wisdom, discernment, however you want to view that, to understand what the good fish are and what the rotten fish are. But yeah. Oh, yes.
I actually would hope if I was a disciple, I would have said, "No, Lord, I really don't get this." Because the kingdom of heaven is like a net. I can understand the harvest process and the separation process, but my understanding of heaven is the finished product, not the process.
Mm.
He lets down the net and pulls up everything, which is, to my mind, like the great harvest at the end, where then the separations happen and into the furnace. But again, that the net is like heaven, that here is catching everything. I don't get it, Lord.
Yeah, that is a great point, because I thought the same thing when I read through this, because Jesus is talking about a lot of different things that I am just not sure how familiar they really would have been. Yeah, they say yes, and maybe that's true, or maybe they kind of got some of it, but I do wonder, when Jesus does talk about, the kingdom of heaven separating the good and the bad, and it also talks about the blazing furnace with weeping and gnashing of teeth, which is referenced quite a bit in the Gospels, that specific phrase. You have to wonder how much they really understood of that. And not only that, but I wonder, and here's another question I pose, when Jesus was hanging out with tax collectors, which would have been viewed as traitors at the time, or when he was hanging out with prostitutes, which would definitely not have been considered good at the time, as they understood good, how do they reconcile what he's saying here with the actions of Jesus, with him hanging out with people who would have not been considered good people or savory people, right? How does this make sense from their perspective, not quite fully understanding, as I know, or as I would say, not really understanding what Jesus' death would mean quite yet? At least it doesn't seem like they know what it would mean quite yet. How do you think they reconcile that with the good and the bad? I will say another thing that's interesting to look up in the Greek, it says bad, but some other synonyms that you can use to describe bad is rotten, worthless, corrupt. So those are other ways we can view that. And I think that's useful because bad can be a bit general sometimes, to say something is bad or good can be a little open to interpretation. But yes.
I have one other thing that I see here. It says, this is how it will be at the end of the age.
Mm.
You know, so many people, and I'm not trying to be, I could get in trouble here. You know how we have this thought about the 7-year trap, being taken out before, but here it's looking as though he's going to grab all at once.
Mm.
And those that are not really following accordingly and have not given their life to Christ would be the ones that are rotten, bad, whatever you want to call it. And those that are truly, his are taken into the kingdom of heaven. And notice the kingdom of heaven is thought of here, this is a future sense and not a time now. So I think there's some way of looking at this in a sense of like, how do we really separate out the times and the seasons?
Mm. Yeah, and it would have been interesting for me. I didn't look this up, but it would have been interesting for me to look up when it says end of the age, kind of what that means specifically. Because, yeah, I agree. My instinct is to say it kind of means at the end of time, right? At the end of our time here on earth as is, right? That's what I would think too, and that might be the case. But yeah, it does seem that at some point in time, whether it be the very end or even at some other point, at some other time, it does seem like there is this separating. Very similar to, if you guys remember the parable of like the sheeps and the goats, where Jesus talks about like, to some I'll put on the left, some I'll put on the right, and some will say, when did I help you? And he'll say, help me when I was hungry, when I was in need. And some will say, well, Jesus, of course I know you. And then he'll basically say, you didn't help me when I was hungry and I was in need, which seems similar in the sense that you're separating again, just like you did in the other parable. Yes?
It does make me think of the verse that says, on that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, didn't we do all these things in your name?
Mm-hmm.
He'll say, depart from me, I never knew you. So those are people that believe they are going to heaven, but never got it right. Basically, they weren't truly following with all their heart.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's definitely the case that if there's any verse, and again, I don't want to be here to like make people like go home and be like, oh, geez, do I really believe in Jesus? I don't know if I really do, reading these verses. I don't want to do that to anybody here, but it should give you at least a little unease to know that there's just still a lot we don't know, that there's still searching that needs to be done, that we still, just because we've said the prayer once and because we believe Jesus is Lord, that's not the end of the story. It's a constant walking of the path, right? It's a constant continuing to follow. Just like when you're married, right? You're not just saying the vows and you're like, I'm done, that's good. Locked them up, we're good to go. It's a constant renewing of the vows. It's a constant continuing to be committed, right? And so that's kind of how I view that. Yeah, U.S.
Another way to look at it is like the kingdom of heaven being like a net that was let down and catches all kinds of fish. You could take that to a personal level. It's said that children catch more than more is caught than is taught, and the kingdom of heaven could be that person being able to separate the good things that are in their life, or the good things that they've caught, and the bad, and the kingdom of heaven being a constant process of that.
Yeah, I think that that's true. Even though this is referring to, we believe in it, it sounds like it's most referring to kind of a separation of heaven and hell, right? But I think that that's very true in the sense that you're born again. You're constantly being renewed. You're constantly, even when we understand and believe in Christ, we understand that we're still sinful. We're sinner and saint, like Paul says. And so we're constantly throwing away the rotten and trying to keep the pure and the clean, right?
That being the process being like the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah? Yes?
Adding on to that, verse 52, therefore every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven, referring to it's a now process of being a disciple in the kingdom. And then the end where it says, at the end, when the end of the age comes, when he brings up his treasure in the storeroom, it'll be old and new.
Mm.
Meaning it's an ongoing work. Old treasures is from a long time ago, work that you did a long time ago, new treasures are the continued work.
Yeah. those specific verses which you're alluding to exactly, it reminds me of when Jesus said he did not come to abolish a law but fulfill the law, right? So Jesus is saying, I'm taking the Old Testament. I'm taking this. All this is pointing to the same thing. It's all the same treasure, you guys. It's very common, obviously, in our culture today to be like, Old Testament God, kind of angry, kind of mean, kind of bad. Let's just not worry about Old Testament God. He's kind of, I don't know about him. But Jesus is cool. We can focus on like hippie Jesus, and that'll appeal to people, right? But this seems to be saying pretty directly, like, no, the Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament is the same as the New, and we're bringing out both the old treasures and the new, both what was presented and what Jesus is presenting. Yes. Oh, has somebody not been called on? Yes.
I kind of already forgot what it was.
That's all right. Yes.
I think it's interesting. The kingdom of heaven to me seems like an abstract concept, and Jesus is using all these very ordinary objects to try to explain an abstract concept. And it seems like there's a lot of angles to the kingdom of God. So you have a treasure that needs to be found. It's so valuable that you have to go find it. But then it itself is a net that brings in the fish, and it just seems like this kingdom of heaven is something that we have to be looking for, but also is it kind of going back to what US and Lisa were talking about, is there is this process that when we interact with it, it's doing something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's clear as believers that we believe the kingdom of heaven is a real, literal, tangible thing, right? But it does also seem like it is the case that it's not just that. At least I would say it seems like it's not just that. It's something more, actually. It seems like it's definitely I don't even know if I want to say a mindset, because I don't know if that would be doing it service, but it almost seems like it is in the sense that, here's something I'm thinking about, in the sense that every nation, right? Every nation has ideals. Like the United States, the ideals of the United States, like based on the Declaration of Independence, was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Like that was the ideal of the United States and is the ideal of the United States. And so in a sense, I'm kind of just trying to think of a fair comparison. Maybe it's fair, maybe it's not. But the United States is both a literal place and also an ideal. Now, I'm not trying to compare the United States to the kingdom of heaven, so I'm not that patriotic. But the United States is both a literal place and an ideal. And in the same sense, I think maybe, and somebody can rebuke me if they think I'm wrong, that's fair, but maybe the kingdom of heaven is both a literal place and an ideal, or a mindset, or a way in which you ought to act and live out your life. At least that's how I'm seeing it. Yes?
In here, it's also neat to see because we are trying to understand what Jesus is talking about, but from his perspective, he's seeing all of it. And how amazing it must be to see all of it, and him giving them glimpses of what he already knows is coming. And we'll never really fully understand eternity until we're in it, and what the time looks like, because it's almost devoid of time. So it's just interesting his perspective and giving it to people, and just seeing that he's not just this man who walked the earth. He's divinely, he is God.
Yeah.
And so there's just so many great little nuggets, and there's so many speculatory things we could talk about, and that's one of my favorite things in studying scripture, where it's not plainly said. Here's a speculatory idea. What was it like organically at that time? What was it like being there, hearing what he had to say, that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
stuff that just hooks and can really get people re-energized about the Bible, or draw them closer to the Bible, that this is not just a story we're reading about. This really happened.
Yep.
We're getting the spiritual cliff notes of what was written down at the time of what was going on at the time. And that's exciting. It's what captivates me. It's what keeps me. Because we're not just reading a document. It's a true document. It actually happened.
Yeah. I'm going to butcher this, but I think it was Tolkien, or maybe it was Lewis. It was probably Lewis who said this. I think Lewis basically said that the Bible was the greatest of all stories because it was real. But, yeah.
So I was thinking about this verse 52 here, where therefore every teacher of the law who has become a disciple. Jesus talked a lot about the scribes and the Pharisees, and this right here sounds very much like if there was a scribe or a Pharisee who became a disciple, then he would possess already the Old Testament treasures in his storehouse, and now with the experience that he's having with Jesus and the things that he's learning, that would be the new treasures, and how valuable that kind of person in the kingdom could be in helping draw in like a net.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Kind of talking to, what I was saying earlier about kind of this idea of the Gentiles being given the gospel. They would have gotten the new treasures, but in many ways it would be harder for them to gather or grasp the old treasures, right? Which I think is just speculating here, which may be part of the reason why in so many of Paul's letters he's talking about them to stay away from sexual immorality and all these other things. All the things that many Jews who studied the Old Testament would have just known, oh, that was a given. Of course you don't do those things. We know that. But for a lot of the Gentiles, it's like, well, this is new to us. We didn't know you weren't supposed to do these extremely explicit things, which I won't say in church. But yeah, yes.
Let me ask one question here. And he says, therefore, every teacher of the law who has become a disciple of the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house, who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old. The idea of new treasures as well as old. Remember the idea of looking at these guys that come around, they got this gal that they pulled out. They said, she's been caught in adultery. She's been caught in adultery. Where is the adulterer? Where's the guy?
Mm-hmm.
I want to know, was he in the crowd too?
Yeah, that's a good
But
question.
no matter how you look at it, this gal, she was an adulteress. And what did Jesus say to her? She was without sin.
Mm-hmm.
There's the old and the new.
Mm-hmm.
The old and the new as well. So many times, the storeroom is, and I think this is what the storeroom is. The storeroom is the Old Testament. He's talking about the Old Testament being a participle of all these things. And they're teachers of the law. They should know these things. And they are acting as, in a lot of cases, they're acting as, we know this, we understand this, but yet and still, do they really understand the depth of what has been said, what has been brought out? And I think too many times, people look at it in the wrong sense. They look at it as if it's something that can be literally overlooked because they're not willing to take a deeper look inside themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good specific example in terms of the way in which Jesus used the old and the new to bring about a newer understanding, kind of combining both. Yes.
It's interesting because the parables on the top are really kind of like, if you see, they're kind of self-explanatory, right?
Mm-hmm.
For ones that has eyes and ears to hear, we kind of get these top parables, right? But what's really strange is 52, he really changes us up here.
Yeah.
Right? Now when all of a sudden 52, and if I'm a disciple and I'm sitting here with Jesus, and I'm like, all right, yeah, I get the fish. Yeah, I get the wheat thing. Yeah, I get the pearl thing. I'm tracking. And then all of a sudden he's like, hey, did you get all that? And as a disciple, I'm sitting there like, well, yeah, I got all that. And he goes, all right, let me change it up and go something just a little bit more off. But do you really get it? And he brings in this storehouse, new treasure, old treasure.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, what do you call Ethan, when you have to go deeper? What's the word?
The remez?
The remez. So he lays a whole remez on it, and he says, all right, if you really do get it, do you understand this one that is just a little bit deeper?
Mm.
Because it's really strange, because 52 is a complete change-up.
That's right.
Yeah.
It changes the whole thing. And it's only after they say yes. Well, is it really a yes? Are you pacifying me and saying, well, yeah, I get it? You know what I mean? Well, do you really get it?
Yeah.
Because if you you'll get this next piece of, hey, it's like every teacher of the law who has become a disciple, that is an order, you know what I mean? So.
Yep. Yeah, Steve, behind you. Yep.
I've been chewing on 52 for a bit now, and I feel like the reason it changes up is because now he's saying, therefore, every teacher of the law, versus before he was explaining, like, more or less what the kingdom of heaven is in those explanations. And then the new treasures as well as the old are going to be this outreach of the education of the kingdom of heaven. Of the new treasures are the Gentiles are going to be coming in whenever you're teaching them the laws and everything. And then the old is trying to appeal to like the Pharisees and get them to see the true light of the kingdom of heaven by explaining it to them, even though they know the Old Testament, they've read it religiously. But having that other explanation, since you are the teacher, you have found your pearl, share that pearl with everyone else, they'll find their own pearl.
Yeah, I think that actually, that's a great point with 52. I think there's something to the fact that we all often hear about how Jesus was with the Pharisees, and we've talked about this before, but I think there's something to the fact that he was with them often. And that's because, A, they were willing to, even though many times in conniving ways, willing to at least talk to him and debate with him or discuss with him. And so that was a part of it, so he could actually have dialogue with them. But the other part of it is, I think Jesus understood and saw the value of a teacher of the law who understood the new treasures. That's what we see in Paul when he converts. That's what you see in Nicodemus to an extent, right? And so I think Jesus saw the value in that. He understood that the Old Testament wasn't just to be cast aside, but the Old Testament was actually to be brought into the new. I think that's very, very indicative of that. I think I'm going to have to move forward. Don't skip the next slide. I'll give you guys credit. I thought you guys were going to talk about something else. I thought you were going to focus on like the weeping and gnashing of teeth part. Because I just assumed people would be like, oh, what's that? Let's talk about that. But no, you guys didn't. So bravo, everybody. Good job for taking a completely different direction. So we'll go to this last part here. And I'd say keep in mind maybe verse 52 when we read this. But 53, when Jesus had finished these parables, he moved on from there. Coming to his hometown, he began teaching the people in their synagogue. And they were amazed. Where did this man get his wisdom and these miraculous powers, they asked. Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't they brothers of James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things? And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own town and in his own home. And he did not do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. So we get a bunch of parables, and then we get this, which is a story of Jesus' ministry as he went to his hometown. So what are some things that kind of come to mind that stick out as we read this? Yes?
It's his hometown, but the scripture calls it their synagogue, not his synagogue.
Interesting. Yeah, that's true. I didn't look into that, but that's true. And that is a very interesting distinction, coming to his hometown and begin teaching in their synagogue. Yeah, why was it, if it's his hometown, why isn't it his synagogue? Or why isn't he related to it? Like, why is there a separation there, right? That's a good point. I actually didn't think of that as I read this. That is interesting. That is very interesting. Probably done on purpose. Yep.
I thought, too, it's really interesting that Mary is named by name. And they're thinking it's Joseph's son, probably, but they don't name him. They only name the mother. And then clearly, even though we don't see much of this in Scripture, he's got sisters, too, which, or half-sisters, I guess you look at them that way. But there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of mention of them except for these few little things, and they aren't named either, but the brothers are named.
Yeah, and I'm fairly certain, I guess I didn't look into it, but obviously when it talks about like James, Joseph, Simon, Judas, these are different individuals than what we know from the disciples in which Jesus follows. But I think James, if I remember correctly, might be the one who wrote the book of James. Is that correct? I think it is. I think that's the belief anyways. Yep. Yes, yep. So that's the belief anyways. But yeah, so that's also interesting given the fact that James knew who Jesus was growing up. But yeah. Yeah, any other thoughts on this particular? Lots. Yes.
So, the last line where it talks about miracles and faith, I think if we look at the modern church, a lot of times when people are praying for things, for miracles or healings or whatever, it's always if it's God's will. I think the Bible's really clear that it's God's will to bless and to heal. But we never want to talk about people's faith because we don't want to hurt their feelings. And here, it wasn't because it wasn't God's will to do miracles, it was because of their lack of faith.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting thing that we don't look at as a modern church anymore because we don't want to offend people. I'm not saying it's always a faith issue, because that would be kind of ignorant, I think, because the Bible's pretty diverse, but I think we have to look at the fact that there's faith involved in a lot of things. There is a part we play, not just, well, a lot of people, I think, treat prayer as a lottery. Is God going to answer it or not? And I think a lot of times it's based on, we've already decided in our own mind if he's going to answer it or not. So.
Yeah, that's a real tough thing to wrestle with. But I think it's pretty clear that the Bible doesn't give us what I would call like cookie cutter answers when it comes to a lot of those things. It talks about having lack of faith, and we'll hear other times where Jesus says like he credited like the woman who touched his cloak, she had faith, and that's why she was healed. But many times, yeah, the Bible does talk about faith or lack of faith when it comes to those types of things. But also Paul talks about, the thorn in his side, which God said he kept there in order to keep him humble, basically, in order for him to learn from that. And so I think there's an intentional, I would say, wrestle. Some people who I think are not being honest about it or are trying to portray it in a certain way would say it's contradictory. But I don't think it's contradictory at all. I think it's an intentional wrestle that we're having with God. It's that same good type of wrestling that we ought to have as we walk in our walk with God. Sky? Yeah.
I had a question. What is the author, Matthew, trying to get at by telling this story right after Jesus explains the kingdom of heaven? And then suddenly Jesus goes to his hometown and he's like, yeah, this isn't working. Like, what's the correlation? What was happening before, and why is this the next thing that Matthew is telling us?
Yeah. I definitely have a theory on how I think it seems to be related. The theory that I have is it seems like Jesus was just talking about the old and the new, and not just that, but he was talking about like the separating of the good from the bad, as well as talking about earlier about finding the treasure. It seems to me, at least from when I'm reading these parables, one of the things I see is it seems that Jesus is calling us to be actively looking for the kingdom of heaven. And we do this often when it comes to people we know. When we know somebody and that person has changed or grown up, a lot of times it's hard for us to view that person as different, right? It's hard for us to view that person as not what they were, but instead what they are, especially when you have a kid growing up in a town where he was just born to, a typical run-of-the-mill carpenter. How could this person be special, right? The special people are the ones who are born in ivory towers or in castles, right? They're not born amongst us. They're not born amongst the carpenters. And so I feel like to an extent, it relates to Matthew's theme of the mumser in the sense of saying like the lowest of us are going to be the kings. It's the upside down kingdom. That's how I view this, at least in terms of thematically. Yes?
I think it kind of plays into the idea, too, that our doubt has as much power as our faith in our relationship with God. But God did create us in his image to be creative in the way we live and the way that we walk in our spiritual lives. So walking in doubt can have just as drastic of an effect in our lives personally as if we were to walk in faith. Mindful of the power that we have.
Yeah, I think that's huge thing. And I think really if there's any actual choices that we have as human beings, it seems like to me that the only real true choices that we have are what we're going to put faith in, right? What we choose to worship. I know in Jungian psychology, many times God will actually be used in terms of the thing in which you worship. So if you value money more than anything else, that is your God, right? If you value security, that is your God. And so that's what you're putting faith in. That's what you are living your life for. I think with it being 11 o'clock, I have a story here that I think kind of relates to this. And then I would ask, the worship team to come up and start to play. So, yeah. So as I was going through a lot of this, and I was reading about Jesus going back to his hometown and being, judged for being the son of a carpenter and for not really being given a chance, this actually kind of stirred about and made me think of a time roughly about like 12 years ago when I was a camp counselor. So at this time, we had our site in Iowa, and I was camp counselor there, completely new, but we also had this thing called VBS, which you guys probably have maybe heard of, Vacation Bible School. It's in the summer where all the parents get to send their kids to the church for a day, so the parents can actually have a day of rest and relaxation, and the kids can sing songs and learn about God, so it's a win-win for everybody, right? But as we're at this Vacation Bible School, and I was one of the people there was this one little kid in this small Iowa town named Dakota. And this little guy, the first time I met him, no joke, he just came up to me and he said, "Yeah, you guys all say you have Jesus in you, but I have Satan in me." And I said, "Okay, why do you say that?" And he's like, "Well, Satan's just, I don't know, it just seems like everybody's just talking about Jesus all the time, but I don't really get it, and Satan just seems cool." Something along those lines is what he said. As I hung out with this kid, because I basically got designated to watch this kid, because through singing, through teaching, through everything we did, this kid was like acting out, being loud, not listening to what he was supposed to do, all this other stuff, right? And so this kid ends up not listening at all, but I was kind of the designated guy who's just keep Dakota in check, right? Just make sure he doesn't ruin it for the rest of the kids. But I began to notice something very interesting as time went on, is that he ended up really enjoying his time there. And when I was with him, I didn't scold him, I just talked to him. I just said, "Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Don't you want to join the kids? Don't you want to play games? Don't you want to sing songs?" And it was really interesting because over time, this kid got much, much more interested in joining everybody else. And it had probably been almost the end of the Vacation Bible School at that point. And the pastor of that church went up to me at the end when this Dakota, actually had really pulled a 180 and was actually doing great. He was doing fantastic. But this pastor came up to me and she said, "I'm really sorry that you've had to deal with Dakota. I tried to make sure that he wasn't here. I tried to make sure that he wasn't involved. But, parents kind of forced my hand, so I had to." So having seen him change a lot throughout the week, and having seen him really make just a lot of different strides, and it's not something I'm happy to admit here, but I never wanted to punch a pastor more in the face. I was very upset at this woman. And she was explaining to me how he's a problem kid and the whole family's a problem in this small town, and that they're just, they try to do their best with him. And I understand, I'm not living there, so I understand it's got to be frustrating. Man, did I even give the kids a chance? To just know that those kids in that small hometown are just judged, they're just deemed bad from birth because of the family that they're in. And that makes me extremely happy and hopeful and thankful for the fact that we have a Jesus who believes in grace, who believes in redemption, who believes in repentance, who believes in turning things around. And so when we think of good and bad, like we're talked here in the parables, when we talk about, catching the righteous and the wicked with the nets, the kingdom of heaven, it's just good, I think, good for us to focus as Christians to know that isn't dependent upon what somebody's done in the past. It's not dependent on what you've done in the past. Everybody has the capacity with Christ at the center, to change, to turn, to repent. So I have no idea what is going on right now with that, with Dakota. I haven't seen him in a long time since I was there. You know, I've prayed randomly at times and I've thought about it. But I just pray that as we move forward, we're giving ourselves a chance, not letting the past haunt us, nor are we letting other people define us because of who we used to be. But we can be born again. We can be redeemed. We can search for the kingdom of heaven. So I'd just like us to reflect on that now as we go through the worship.